The wind came down from the Sangre de Cristo Peaks on the 3rd of November, 1887, carrying a cold that had no business arriving so early in the season. The mercury in the thermometer outside the Deerfield General Store read 18 degrees at 7:30 in the morning, and old Ezekiel Tanner, who had prospected these foothills for 30 years, stood on the wooden sidewalk and watched the northwestern sky with the expression of a man counting his remaining days. The clouds building over the distant ridges were not the soft gray of ordinary snowfall, but something heavier, something with a bruised purple underbelly that spoke of violence yet to come. 412 souls called Deerfield home that morning, most of them still sleeping in frame houses and canvas-roofed shanties that offered about as much protection from true cold as a Sunday newspaper. The mining settlement sat exposed on a treeless plateau, stripped bare by the needs of industry, and what trees remained within a mile's walk had been felled for timber, for fuel, for the endless appetite of the stamp mills that crushed silver ore into powder and profit. The plateau offered no natural windbreak, no shelter from the storms that swept down from the high country each winter, and this winter, though no one yet understood it, would demand a reckoning from every structure built by human hands upon that naked ground. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1884, a man named Asher Ashcroft had stepped off the Denver and Rio Grande coach with nothing but a canvas bag, a leather-bound journal, and the hollowed expression of someone who had lost everything worth keeping. He was 34 years old, a widower whose wife and infant daughter had perished in a Philadelphia tenement fire that had taken 17 lives on a January night so cold that the fire brigades found their hoses frozen solid before they could unroll them. The flames had climbed 4 stories in 11 minutes. Asher had been working a night shift at the ironworks 3 blocks away, and by the time he reached the building there was nothing left to reach for. He had stood in the street with his hands blistered from trying to move debris that was still too hot to touch, and he had watched wooden walls collapse into ash and ember, and something in him had died alongside his family that night. His grandfather, Ezra Ashcroft, had been a ship's cook from Gloucester who sailed the Arctic waters when whaling still meant something, and the old man had survived 2 winters frozen into the ice off the Labrador coast. Ezra had died in 1879, his lungs finally giving out after 60 years of pipe smoke and salt air, passing peacefully in his bed at the age of 73, with his grandson holding his hand. In those last weeks, when Ezra could no longer rise from his mattress, he had pressed the leather journal into Asher's hands and made him promise to read every word. The journal contained 40 years of observations on survival, on the secrets of earth-insulated baking, on how properly designed underground chambers could maintain temperatures for days without fuel, on how carved stone holds heat like a living thing. Ezra had learned these things from necessity, trapped in a ship's hull while the Arctic winds screamed overhead, and he had written them down so that his knowledge would not die with him. Asher carried the journal west because he could no longer bear to walk streets where wooden buildings stood like kindling, waiting for a spark. The land office in Deerfield had been happy to sell him 40 acres of what they called the cliff parcel, a stretch of soft red sandstone face that jutted up from the plateau's eastern edge like the prow of a ship made of stone. 63 cents an acre for vertical rock that no one could farm, no one could graze, no one could mine for silver. The clerk had barely suppressed his amusement while filling out the deed, and Asher had signed his name without expression, paid his $25.20, and walked out into the afternoon sun with ownership of what everyone in Deerfield would soon call useless ground. He had named his horse Solomon, a 15-hand sorrel gelding with a star blaze and 3 white socks, purchased from a rancher outside Pueblo for $40. Solomon had a calm disposition and strong hindquarters, qualities essential for hauling loads of chiseled stone down the cliff face to where they could be carted away. The horse seemed to understand, in the way that good horses sometimes do, that his new owner was a man of few words and steady hands, and the two of them developed the silent partnership of creatures who had both learned that survival required patience, Asher began his work in the spring of 1885, starting with a single opening in the sandstone face at a height of 12 feet above the plateau floor. He had studied the rock for months, walking the cliff in all weather, watching how water flowed across its surface during rain, noting where the stone showed natural seams and fractures. The sandstone here was soft enough to carve but dense enough to hold its shape, a gift of geology that Asher recognized from his grandfather's descriptions of the stone-lined root cellars that kept food fresh through New England winters. His technique combined three methods. The first was simple chisel work, driving sharpened steel into stone with a 4-pound hammer, following the natural grain of the rock to break away manageable pieces. The second was water freezing, a method Ezra had learned from the Labrador Inuit, drilling small holes into the stone, filling them with water, and allowing winter nights to freeze the water into ice, which expanded and fractured the rock along predictable lines. The third was patience, the willingness to remove no more than 6 inches of depth per week, allowing the stone to settle and reveal its own weaknesses. The first room took 4 months to complete. It measured 14 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and 8 feet tall at the center of its arched ceiling, and Asher slept in it for the first time on the 7th of September, 1885, with Solomon picketed outside and the stars visible through the opening that served as a door. The temperature inside, even in late summer, held at 54 degrees, exactly as his grandfather's journal had predicted. The stone breathed slowly, releasing the warmth it had absorbed during the day and drawing cool air from deep within the cliff face, creating a natural regulation that no wooden building could match. By the following spring, Asher had carved a second chamber and begun the third. The work consumed him in ways he had not expected, the rhythm of hammer and chisel driving out the memories that ambushed him in quiet moments. He purchased his supplies from the Deerfield General Store in quantities that raised eyebrows: 300 feet of wooden shelving boards, 17 pounds of iron nails, 47 glass jars from a catalog in St. Louis. The store owner, a practical man named Harold Sims, asked once what Asher intended to build. "A home," Asher had replied. "One that will not burn." Sims had nodded slowly and said nothing more, but the word spread through Deerfield as words do in small places. The fire survivor, the man carving rooms into rock, the fellow who bought useless cliffside because he feared flames. The story transformed with each telling until it became something between pity and amusement, and by the summer of 1886, most of the town's population had walked out to the cliff face at least once to watch Asher work. He paid them no attention. He carved. The central chamber, the largest of the eventual 7 rooms, housed the earth-insulated baking oven that was his grandfather's masterwork in miniature. Asher built it according to specifications written in Ezra's hand, a double-walled stone chamber with an 8-inch gap between the walls filled with packed dry earth. The inner chamber measured 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, lined with flat stones he had cut from the same sandstone and fitted together without mortar. The door was cast iron, ordered from a foundry in Denver for $11, including freight, and its edges sealed with clay mixed from local soil and water. The design allowed heat to be captured and released slowly, so that a fire built in the morning would keep the oven warm enough for baking through the following night. Asher tested the oven in October of 1886, loading it with piñon wood and building a fire that burned for 6 hours. The next morning, 22 hours after the flames had died, the interior temperature still measured 230 degrees. He baked his first loaf of bread in that oven on the 19th of October, a simple wheat round that emerged with a crust the color of dark honey, and he ate it alone in his stone chamber while Solomon dozed outside. And for the first time since Philadelphia, he felt something that was not grief. The work continued. The 7th room took shape in the winter of 1886, carved during months when other men huddled near their stoves and cursed the cold. Asher found the work easier in winter when the water freezing technique could be applied daily rather than waiting for overnight temperatures to drop. He drilled his holes in the morning, filled them with water drawn from the spring that seeped from a crack in the sandstone 50 yards to the south, and returned the following dawn to find clean fractures waiting for his chisel. The stone came away in slabs that Solomon hauled down the cliff path on a wooden sledge, each load deposited in a growing pile that Asher would later shape into the retaining wall that protected the entrance from spring runoff. The dwelling now extended 47 feet into the rock face, a distance that surprised even Asher when he measured it with a length of rope marked in foot increments. The main living chamber occupied the center, with 3 sleeping alcoves branching from its northern wall, like fingers reaching deeper into the cliff. The 2 storage rooms flanked the entrance, their shelves already bearing the weight of provisions that Asher had been accumulating since the previous harvest season. Harold Sims at the general store had grown accustomed to Asher's orders, though he still recorded them with a raised eyebrow and an occasional low whistle. 400 pounds of flour, purchased in 50-pound sacks at $3.20 each. 200 pounds of dried beans, sorted into cloth bags that Asher sewed himself from canvas remnants. 18 smoked hams from a farmer outside Pueblo who had more pigs than he could sell to the mining camps. 47 jars of preserved vegetables, some purchased and some traded for labor when Asher helped the widow Parsons repair her root cellar in exchange for her surplus pickled beets and green tomatoes. The supplies represented nearly 2 years of careful accumulation, of wages earned hauling freight for the mining company during the months when the ground was too frozen to carve, of pelts from rabbits and the occasional deer that wandered across his property. Asher kept a ledger in the back pages of his grandfather's journal, recording every purchase, every trade, every jar sealed and labeled. The total expenditure for provisions alone exceeded $140, a sum that would have purchased a modest frame house in Deerfield with enough left over for furniture. Instead, the money had disappeared into shelves lined with sustenance, into stores that could feed a family through a winter that never ended, into preparation for a disaster that Asher could not name but felt approaching with the certainty of a man who had already lost everything once. The townspeople of Deerfield noticed. Jasper Ridgway, superintendent of the Deerfield Consolidated Mine, first coined the name during a Sunday gathering in July of 1887. The Methodist Church had organized a potluck dinner to celebrate the Independence holiday, held in the cleared field behind the company offices where long tables groaned under the weight of baked goods and roasted meats. Nearly every family in town had contributed something, and the conversation flowed as freely as the lemonade that Mrs. Whitfield had prepared in a copper tub. Asher had not been invited, though he would not have attended regardless. He was 40 feet up his cliff face that afternoon, working on the ventilation shaft that would allow smoke from the earth oven to escape without drawing heat away from the interior chambers. The shaft was a delicate piece of engineering, a 6-inch tube carved through solid rock at a precise angle that would create natural draft without permitting rain or snow to enter. He had been working on it for 3 weeks and expected another 2 before completion. Ridgway stood near the dessert table, a plate of pie in one hand and a glass of something stronger than lemonade in the other, holding court with a half-dozen men who worked in the mine offices. The superintendent was a large man with mutton-chop whiskers and a gold watch chain stretched across a considerable belly, and he possessed the confident volume of someone who had never been told to lower his voice. "That fellow Ashcroft is still at it," he announced, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. I rode past his burrow this morning on my way to inspect the upper shafts. The man was hanging from a rope halfway up the cliff, pounding at the rock like a woodpecker with delusions of grandeur. Laughter rippled through the group. Margaret Ridgway, the superintendent's wife, paused in her conversation with the pastor's wife to listen with obvious interest. Ridgway warmed to his audience. "I have watched that man for 2 years now, and I have reached a conclusion. He digs like a rodent because he thinks like one. Too simple to build a proper house like civilized men, So he burrows into the dirt like a badger preparing for winter. He gestured expansively with his pie plate. The badger's burrow, that is what we should call it. The badger's burrow, home of the man too foolish to know that human beings live above ground. The name caught and spread, as such names do in small communities hungry for entertainment. By the end of the week, children were daring each other to approach the cliff face and shout badger at the opening in the rock. By the end of the month, the name had become so common that Harold Sims had to suppress a wince every time a customer used it in his store, knowing that Asher would eventually hear. Margaret Ridgway proved equally efficient in her domain. She organized the Women's Auxiliary of the Methodist Church, oversaw the committee that planned community dances, and maintained the social calendar that determined who was invited to quilting circles, christening parties, and the annual 4th of July celebration. In the weeks following her husband's pronouncement, she ensured that Asher Ashcroft's name appeared on none of these lists. The exclusion was thorough and deliberate. When the church organized a work party to repair the roof of the widow's home, Asher was not asked to participate despite his demonstrated skill with tools. When the mining company hosted a dance to celebrate a particularly profitable quarter, his name was omitted from the posted invitation list. When the ladies' sewing circle met to prepare clothing for families whose providers had been injured in the mines, Margaret Ridgway made a point of noting that they needed only civilized hands for civilized work. Asher heard about the exclusion through Harold Sims, who mentioned it with careful neutrality while measuring out a length of rope for the ventilation shaft project. Sims was a businessman who could not afford to take sides, but he was also a decent man who found the Ridgways' campaign distasteful. "They are talking about you something fierce," Sims said, coiling the rope. "The superintendent and his wife have made you a particular subject of attention." Asher paid for the rope and tucked it under his arm. "What sort of attention?" Sims hesitated. "Mockery, mostly. The nickname has spread. They call your place the Badger's Burrow, call you simple for living in rock instead of wood. Mrs. Ridgway has made sure you're not welcome at any gathering she can influence." Asher stood for a moment, his face showing nothing of whatever he felt. Then he nodded once, slowly, and turned toward the door. "Let them laugh above ground while I work below it." He spoke the words without bitterness, without anger, with the flat certainty of a man stating an obvious fact about the weather. Then he walked out into the August sunshine and returned to his cliff, where Solomon waited patiently beside the water trough that Asher had carved from a single block of fallen sandstone. The warnings came throughout September, written in a language that only those who listened could read. Asher noticed the pikas first. The small, round-eared mammals that lived in the rock slides below the cliff had always gathered grass during the autumn months, carrying mouthfuls of dried vegetation to their dens beneath the boulders. But this September, they carried triple loads, their cheeks bulging with more material than Asher had ever seen them attempt. They worked from dawn until full dark, a frenzy of activity that spoke of preparation beyond ordinary seasons. He mentioned this to Solomon one evening while brushing the gelding's coat in the fading light. The horse stood with his head lowered, enjoying the attention as Asher worked through the tangles that a summer's worth of cliff work had left in the sorrel mane. "The pikas know something," Asher said quietly. His voice was soft, uncertain, the voice of a man who had grown unaccustomed to speaking his thoughts aloud. "They are preparing for more than an ordinary winter." He paused, the brush still in his hand. "My grandfather wrote about this in his journal. The year before the great freeze that trapped his ship, the lemmings moved south 3 weeks early. The seabirds abandoned their nesting cliffs before the eggs had even hatched. The animals knew what was coming, and the men who paid attention survived. The men who did not." He did not finish the sentence. Solomon shifted his weight, pressing slightly against Asher's shoulder in what might have been comfort. There were other signs. The bark on the few remaining pines at the plateau's edge had grown unusually thick on their south-facing sides, as though the trees themselves were building armor against cold that had not yet arrived. Asher cut a section from a fallen branch and measured the bark with his grandfather's calipers, nearly an inch thick compared to the half-inch that was normal for trees of that age. He noted the measurement in his ledger alongside the date. The elk descended from the high country a full month early, moving through the foothills in herds that seemed nervous, unsettled, driven by instincts they could not name. Asher watched them from his cliff in the early mornings, counting their numbers, noting the direction of their travel. They were heading south and east, away from the mountains, seeking lower ground where snow would be shallower and grass might still be found beneath the drifts. He tried once to share these observations. On a morning in late September, he walked into town to purchase additional lamp oil and found several men gathered outside the general store discussing the weather and the price of silver. Ezekiel Tanner was among them, the old prospector who had been in these mountains longer than anyone, and Asher thought that perhaps Tanner might understand. "The animals are preparing for something severe," Asher said, addressing the group. "The Picas are storing 3 times their normal supplies. The elk have come down from the high country a month ahead of season. The pine bark is twice as thick as it should be." The men turned to look at him with expressions ranging from amusement to mild confusion. Jasper Ridgway had just emerged from the mining company offices across the street, and he caught the tail end of Asher's statement. "The badger reads animal droppings like tea leaves," Ridgway announced, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. "Perhaps he should join the circus. We could advertise him as the amazing burrowing prophet, able to predict the future by examining the bowel movements of rodents." Laughter rose from the group. Even men who might otherwise have listened turned away, unwilling to be seen taking the side of the town eccentric against the superintendent of the mine that employed half their neighbors. Asher said nothing more. He purchased his lamp oil, nodded to Harold Sims, and walked back to his cliff with the container tucked under his arm. That evening, he added another 100 pounds of flour to his stores, purchased on credit against the wages he would earn hauling freight before the ground froze. Solomon stood at the base of the cliff as the sun set, his coat glowing copper in the fading light. Asher climbed down from the entrance and stood beside the horse, one hand resting on the warm neck, watching the northwestern sky where clouds were beginning to build. "They will not listen," he said softly. The words came slowly, as though each one required effort to speak. "They have their wooden houses and their canvas roofs and their iron stoves, and they believe that what has always been sufficient will continue to be sufficient. They do not understand that sufficiency depends on conditions remaining the same." Solomon's ears flicked forward, then back. "My grandfather survived because he paid attention when others did not. He watched the animals and the ice and the way the wind changed direction before storms. He built his oven in the belly of a frozen ship because he understood that the earth itself could be made to work for you instead of against you." Asher's hand moved slowly along the horse's neck. "I have done everything he taught me. I have built what he showed me how to build. And when the cold comes, and it will come soon, I will be ready." He stood in silence for a long moment, the man and the horse, watching darkness gather over the distant peaks. "What I cannot say," Asher continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "what I cannot even think too clearly, is how many of them will suffer because they chose to laugh instead of listen. How many children will cry from the cold. How many old ones will simply stop waking." He closed his eyes. "I cannot save them from their own choices, but I can make sure that my door remains open if they find the humility to knock." Solomon turned his head and pressed his muzzle against Asher's chest, a gesture the horse had learned in the 3 years they had worked together. Asher stood with his arms around the animal's neck, breathing in the warm smell of horse and dust and sage, until the stars emerged overhead and the temperature began its nightly descent toward freezing. The next morning, he began preparing the entrance for winter. He had carved a wooden door frame and fitted it with heavy planks joined by iron hinges, creating a barrier that could be sealed against wind and snow. The door included a smaller opening at its center, a window that could be shuttered from inside, allowing him to look out at the weather without exposing the interior to the elements. He tested the seals with water, pouring it along the edges and checking for drips, then packed the remaining gaps with oakum soaked in pine tar. The work continued through October. Asher hauled the last of his winter fuel supply up the cliff path, cords of pinon and juniper that he had cut during the summer months and left to dry in stacks protected by canvas tarps. The wood filled one of the storage rooms from floor to ceiling, enough to keep the earth oven burning for 3 months if necessary, though he calculated that the oven's efficiency would stretch that supply much further. A fire built every third day would maintain baking temperature indefinitely, and the stone walls would retain enough warmth to keep the interior chambers comfortable even during the intervals between burns. He checked his water supply, a 20-gallon barrel positioned beneath the spring seep, with a wooden channel carved into the rock to direct the flow. The spring had never frozen in the 3 years he had observed it, emerging from deep enough within the cliff that ground temperature kept it liquid year-round. He built a small enclosure around the barrel to protect it from wind-driven snow, leaving only a narrow opening through which he could lower his bucket. Solomon received his own winter preparations. Asher had carved a shelter into the base of the cliff, not a full room, but an alcove deep enough to protect a horse from the worst of the wind. He lined it with straw purchased from a farm outside Pueblo and stored bales of hay in the adjacent space, enough to feed the gelding through 4 months of snow cover. A water trough positioned beneath a second seep would provide drink, and the cliff face itself would break the force of storms that came from the northwest. On the 1st of November, Asher climbed to the top of the cliff and looked out across the plateau toward Deerfield. The town spread before him in miniature, its wooden buildings and canvas shanties arranged along the single main street like a child's blocks waiting to be scattered. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, thin streams of gray against a sky that had begun to show the bruised colors of approaching weather. He could see the Ridgway House from here, the largest structure in town. 2 stories of milled lumber with glass windows and a covered porch. He could see the mining company offices where Ridgway conducted his business, the Methodist church where Margaret organized her exclusions, the general store where Harold Sims sold flour and rope and news to anyone who would buy. He could see the bunkhouses where the unmarried miners lived 6 to a room, the widow's home with its patched roof, the small houses where families had planted themselves in hope of silver fortunes that might never arrive. None of them were ready. Asher climbed down from the cliff and returned to his work. There was still time to seal the ventilation shaft against storms, to check the door one final time, to arrange the stores so that the oldest provisions would be used first. There was still time to brush Solomon's coat and speak quiet words into the horse's patient ears. There was still time to sit in the chamber he had carved with his own hands and read from his grandfather's journal by the light of a lamp that burned oil purchased from a man who did not mock him. The badger did not know it was a badger. It only knew how to prepare. It only knew how to survive. The storm announced itself on November 7th with a silence that pressed against the ears like wool. Asher woke in the darkness of his carved chamber and knew before he rose that the world outside had changed. The air carried a weight it had not held the day before, a heaviness that spoke of moisture gathering in quantities beyond ordinary reckoning. He dressed quickly and climbed to the entrance, pushing aside the heavy door he had hung with such care. The sky had vanished. Where yesterday there had been the familiar dome of Colorado blue, now there existed only a wall of gray so uniform and so close that it seemed he might reach out and touch it. The plateau spread before him in eerie stillness, every blade of dead grass motionless, every stone casting no shadow because no sun penetrated that ceiling of cloud. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since he had gone to sleep, and even as he stood watching, the first flakes began to fall. They came down slowly at first, fat and heavy, spiraling in lazy descent like ash from some distant fire. Asher watched them settle on the rocks before his entrance, watched them begin to accumulate on the path that led down to the plateau floor. Within an hour, the ground had disappeared beneath a white shroud that grew thicker with each passing minute. The flakes ceased their lazy spiral and began to fall with purpose, driven by a wind that had awakened from some northern cave and come howling across the mountains with hunger in its throat. By noon, Asher could no longer see Deerfield. The wind had become a living thing, a predator that stalked the plateau with tireless malice. It drove the snow horizontally, transforming the air itself into a weapon that scoured exposed skin and filled the lungs with ice. The temperature continued its relentless descent, dropping through the 20s and into the teens while the day was still young. Asher secured Solomon in the carved alcove, checking that the hay supply remained accessible and the water trough had not frozen. The gelding stood with his hindquarters to the wind, steam rising from his nostrils in clouds that the storm snatched away before they could disperse. Inside the cliff dwelling, the temperature held steady at 54 degrees. Asher built a fire in the earth oven, not because he needed the warmth, but because he knew that warmth might soon be needed by others. The flames caught the dry pinon and juniper, licking up through the carefully arranged wood until the inner chamber glowed with heat. He sealed the iron door and felt the stone walls begin their slow absorption of that energy, storing it in their mass as his grandfather had taught. The clay seals held firm. The double walls trapped the heat between them. The oven would maintain baking temperature for nearly a full day on this single fire, and the surrounding rooms would benefit from the radiant warmth that seeped through 47 feet of carved sandstone. He mixed flour and water and salt, kneading dough with hands that had grown strong from 3 years of work with hammer and chisel. The bread would rise in the warmth of the main chamber, would bake in the morning when the oven had reached its optimal temperature, would emerge golden and fragrant while death howled outside. He covered the bowls with clean cloth and set them on the shelf beside the jars of preserved vegetables, then sat down with his grandfather's journal and read by lamplight while the storm raged. The entries from the winter of 1847 described conditions remarkably similar to what was unfolding outside. "The wind does not merely blow," Ezra Ashcroft had written in his careful hand. "It hunts. It seeks out every crack and seam, every gap in timber or canvas, and it drives the cold through with the patience of a wolf wearing down wounded prey. A man might survive the cold if he could escape the wind. A man might survive the wind if he could escape the cold. But when they hunt together, when cold and wind move as one beast with two heads, then a man survives only if he has prepared ground that neither can reach." Asher closed the journal and listened to the sound of the storm trying to find its way into his home. The wind threw itself against the cliff face with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if it resented the audacity of a man who had carved shelter from living rock. But the stone did not yield. The stone had stood against 1,000 such storms before any man had set foot on this plateau, and it would stand against 1,000 more after the last man had departed. Asher had not defeated the storm. He had simply allied himself with something older and more patient, something that remembered winters when no human eye had witnessed them and would endure winters when no human eye remained. November 8th brought no respite. The thermometer that Asher had hung outside his entrance, visible through a small window carved in the cliff face, showed 12 degrees at what should have been dawn. By midday, it had dropped to 7. By evening, it read 2 degrees below zero, and the wind had not slackened for a single hour. Snow had accumulated to depths that made the plateau's contours unrecognizable, burying familiar rocks and paths beneath drifts that the wind sculpted into fantastic shapes before tearing them apart and rebuilding them elsewhere. From his vantage point, Asher could occasionally glimpse Deerfield through momentary breaks in the driving snow. What he saw did not comfort him. The canvas-roofed shanties had already begun to fail. He could see several collapsed into themselves, their wooden frames unable to bear the weight of snow that accumulated faster than anyone could shovel it away. Smoke rose from the surviving buildings in streams that bent horizontal almost immediately, snatched by winds that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Figures moved through the streets when the storm briefly relented, hunched shapes struggling against drifts that reached their waists, fighting toward the general store or the mining company offices or the Methodist church as if any of those wooden structures could offer real salvation. The Ridgway house still stood, its 2 stories of milled lumber defying the storm with the same arrogance that Jasper Ridgway brought to all his dealings. But Asher noted that the smoke from its chimney had grown thin and irregular, suggesting that even the superintendent's carefully hoarded fuel supply was beginning to run low. The mining company offices showed similar distress, their windows dark and their chimneys cold. Whatever business Ridgway conducted there had ceased, suspended by a storm that recognized no authority and respected no position. November 9th to November 11th compressed into a single endless assault of wind and snow and cold. The temperature dropped through the single digits and into depths that Asher had never experienced, depths that his thermometer could barely register. On the morning of the 11th day, the mercury had retreated so far into its glass prison that Asher estimated the temperature at more than 40 degrees below zero. The wind had not merely continued, but intensified, gusting to speeds that threatened to strip the flesh from any creature foolish enough to venture into its path. Snow no longer fell from the sky, but was simply redistributed by the wind, torn from one drift and deposited in another in an endless rearrangement that buried and revealed and buried again. The first death came that day. Widow Patterson had lived alone in a small house near the edge of town, a woman of 73 winters who had buried 2 husbands and 3 children and had somehow continued breathing through sorrows that would have broken younger souls. Her stovepipe had failed sometime during the night of the 10th, the cold working its way through a crack that summer inspection had declared sound. She had piled every blanket she owned upon her bed. She had worn every garment she possessed. She had prayed, perhaps, to a God who seemed to have turned his face away from Deerfield. And when morning came, she did not rise. Her neighbor found her frozen in her bed, her face peaceful, in a way it had not been for years, her hands folded across her chest as if she had simply decided that 73 winters were enough. If you want to hear more incredible tales of survival and community transformation, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. The Hernandez family had come to Deerfield from New Mexico the previous spring, drawn by rumors of mining work and the promise of a better life for their 3 children. They had purchased a small house with their savings, had patched its roof and reinforced its walls, had done everything that prudent people do when preparing for winter in a strange land. But they had prepared for a Colorado winter as experienced settlers described it, not for the monster that now stalked the plateau. The baby died in her mother's arms on the 12th of November. Maria Hernandez had held little Elena against her chest through 2 days of worsening cold, had breathed warm air against the infant's face, had given up her own blankets and her own food in the desperate mathematics of sacrifice that every parent understands. The older children huddled together in one corner of the single room, their father burning furniture to keep the stove alive, their mother singing soft lullabies to a baby whose cries had grown weaker with each passing hour. And then the crying stopped, and Maria continued singing anyway, because to stop would be to acknowledge a loss that no mother should ever have to name. Thomas Clearwater had been 19 years old, a miner's son who had come to Deerfield seeking his fortune and had found only hard labor and harder luck. On the night of the 13th, he made the journey that had killed him. 12 feet from the bunkhouse door to the privy and back again. He made it to the privy. He did not make it back. They found him the next morning, frozen solid within arm's reach of the door through which he had exited less than an hour before. The wind had disoriented him, had spun him around until he no longer knew which direction led to safety, had hunted him down in the darkness and the cold, and had taken him as it would take prey. The mining company offices collapsed on the 9th day. Asher heard the distant sound of splintering timber even from within his cave, carried on the wind like a scream. He climbed to his entrance and looked out through the brief clearing that followed, and he saw what remained of Jasper Ridgway's empire. A heap of broken boards and scattered papers, the expensive glass windows shattered, the heavy desk where the superintendent had signed orders and counted profits now buried beneath snow that continued to accumulate. The Ridgway house still stood, but Asher could see that its porch had torn away, could see that one of the second-story windows had blown in, could see that the structure was losing its battle against forces that no amount of milled lumber or glass panes could defeat. Throughout the disaster, Asher's cliff dwelling maintained its steady 54 degrees. He baked bread every third day, timing his fires to coincide with the brief periods when the oven needed reheating. The loaves emerged golden and warm, their crust crackling as they cooled on the stone shelf. He ate one loaf himself and set the others aside, wrapped in clean cloth, knowing that they would be needed. He checked his supplies and calculated consumption rates and found that he could sustain himself for 6 months on what he had stored, perhaps longer if he was careful. The preserved vegetables remained crisp in their jars. The smoked hams hung from their hooks in the cool storage room, protected from rot by salt and smoke and temperature. The flour and beans waited in their containers, ready to be transformed into sustenance. Solomon fared well in his alcove, protected from the worst of the wind, his body heat trapped beneath the cliff's overhang. Asher visited him twice daily, bringing water from the seep and breaking off sections of hay from the stored bales. The gelding had grown accustomed to confinement during the years of work on the cliff dwelling, and he accepted this longer restriction with the patience that marked his breed. He pressed his nose against Asher's chest when his master came, seeking the familiar scent and the reassuring touch, and Asher stood with him for long minutes even when the cold made such lingering difficult. On the 14th day of the siege, Pastor Whitfield appeared at the base of the cliff. The minister had walked 2 miles through drifts that reached his chest, his face wrapped in scarves that had frozen stiff with his own breath, his hands thrust deep into pockets that offered little protection against the killing cold. He stood at the bottom of the path that led to Asher's entrance and looked up at the carved rooms visible in the cliff face, and he did not call out or demand or plead. He simply stood, his hat held in hands that shook from exhaustion as much as cold. And he waited. Asher descended. The 2 men faced each other in the howling wind, separated by 6 feet of trampled snow and 3 years of exclusion. Pastor Whitfield's beard had grown ice crystals that sparkled even in the gray light. His eyes, visible above the frozen scarves, held no pride and no anger, and no pretense. "Mr. Ashcroft," he said, and his voice carried barely above the wind. "Widow Patterson is dead. The Hernandez baby is dead. Young Thomas Clearwater is dead. There will be more before this ends." He paused, gathering what remained of his strength. "I have come to ask if you might shelter some who cannot survive in their homes." Asher looked at the minister, at this man who had preached sermons while Asher sat alone in his cave, who had blessed meals at gatherings from which Asher was excluded, who had offered no word of defense when the mockery flowed and the nickname spread. He looked at this man who represented everything that Deerfield had denied him, and he remembered his grandfather's journal and the passage about wolves that hunt together and the ground that neither wind nor cold can reach. "Bring everyone," Asher said. Pastor Whitfield blinked, as if he had prepared himself for negotiation or conditions or the righteous anger that he surely deserved. "Everyone," he repeated. "Everyone who will come," Asher said. "Bring them in shifts. Bring blankets and what food can be spared. I have room for 60 or more if they are willing to share space. Bring them before nightfall if you can. The cold will be worse after dark." The minister stood motionless for a long moment, the wind tearing at his coat and his scarves and his frozen beard. Then he nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been a shiver, and he turned and began the long walk back to Deerfield. By evening, the first of the survivors had arrived. They came in waves throughout that first evening, stumbling through the snow in groups of 3 and 4 and 7, their faces wrapped against the wind that still howled across the plateau like a living thing intent on murder. Pastor Whitfield had organized them with the efficiency of a man who understood that chaos would kill as surely as cold, assigning departure times and travel companions, and ensuring that no one walked alone across the killing ground that Deerfield had become. Asher stood at the entrance to his cliff dwelling and watched them approach, these neighbors who had never been neighbors, these townspeople who had looked through him for 3 years as if he were made of the same stone he carved. The first group included the Hernandez family, Maria still carrying the weight of her daughter's death in her eyes, though not in her arms. Her husband Miguel supported her with one arm, while their 2 surviving children clung to their mother's skirts, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Asher guided them inside without ceremony, showing them to the 3rd sleeping alcove where blankets had been laid across the stone floor, where the steady 54 degrees felt like summer after what they had endured. Maria Hernandez looked at the carved walls, at the smooth ceiling that arched overhead like the inside of a cathedral, and she began to weep silently, tears freezing on her cheeks before Asher gently pressed a warm cloth into her hands. The Ridgways arrived with the second group, Jasper walking with his head bowed and his expensive coat torn at one shoulder where the wind had caught it during the journey. Margaret clutched their 3 children against her, all of them shivering despite the layers they wore, their fine clothes no match for temperatures that had dropped to 37 below zero the previous night. Jasper Ridgway met Asher's eyes for the first time in 3 years, and whatever he saw there made him look away quickly, his jaw tight with something that might have been shame, or might have been the desperate pride of a man who had lost everything but could not yet admit it. Asher showed them to the main chamber, where the earth oven radiated warmth that drew the newcomers like moths to flame. The children pressed their hands against the warm stone and looked up at their mother with expressions of wonder, and Margaret Ridgway stood rigid for a long moment before her shoulders began to shake. She did not speak. She did not need to. By the second day of the rescue, 63 people had passed through Asher's dwelling in rotating shifts. He organized them into groups of 20, with each group staying for 8 hours before returning to their homes to allow the next shift access to the warmth and the food that kept them alive. The system was not perfect, but it was sustainable, and it meant that no one in Deerfield would freeze to death for lack of shelter. Asher taught as he shared. He showed the men how the earth oven worked, how the double walls and the packed dry earth between them captured heat and released it slowly over hours rather than minutes. He demonstrated the mathematics of survival. How much wood produced, how much heat, how long the oven would stay warm after the fire died, how to time the baking so that bread emerged when the oven was neither too hot nor too cool. The women learned to arrange the preserved vegetables so that air could circulate between the jars, preventing the condensation that led to spoilage. The children were assigned to water duty, carrying buckets from the seep 50 yards south and filling the stone basins that Asher had carved for exactly this purpose. If you are finding this story moving and want to hear more tales of resilience and redemption, consider subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications so you can join us for the next incredible journey. Harold Sims, the general store owner who had sold Asher his supplies without mockery over the years, proved particularly adept at the organizational work. He kept lists of who had eaten, who needed medical attention, who was showing signs of frostbite that required treatment. His wife tended to the Hernandez children, singing to them in a voice that reminded Asher of his own mother, dead these 20 years. The bread became the center of everything. Every third day, Asher built a fire in the earth oven and mixed dough from his stores of flour, adding water from the seep and salt from the block he had purchased in Pueblo. The loaves rose slowly in the warm air near the oven, then baked to a golden perfection that drew sighs from people who had not eaten anything warm in days. He taught willing hands to knead the dough, to judge the readiness of the oven by the feel of air against skin, to know when the bread was done by the sound it made when tapped. By the time the storm finally broke on the 23rd of November, 7 different people could operate the oven without supervision. The cost of survival became clear as the snow began to melt. Widow Patterson lay in her frozen bed, discovered by neighbors who had waited too long to check on her. The Hernandez baby, Elena, had been buried in a snowdrift behind the family's house because the ground was too frozen for a proper grave. Thomas Clearwater's body was found 12 feet from the bunkhouse door, his hands outstretched as if he had been reaching for the handle he could not find in the darkness. 14 others had suffered frostbite severe enough to require amputation, including 3 miners who would never work underground again. The mining company offices were a total loss. 18 homes had collapsed under the weight of snow and wind, and another 31 had sustained damage that would require months to repair. But 409 people remained alive, and 312 of them had passed through Asher Ashcroft's cliff dwelling during those 17 days of siege. The gathering came in March. Pastor Whitfield had organized it, approaching Asher 2 weeks prior with a request that was also an invitation. The community needed to speak, the minister said. There were things that needed saying, and they needed to be said in a place where everyone could hear. Would Mr. Ashcroft be willing to attend? Asher had agreed without hesitation. He understood what was coming, had seen it building in the faces of his neighbors as the winter loosened its grip and memory began to sharpen. The people of Deerfield had survived something terrible, and survival demanded reckoning. The Methodist Church was filled to capacity on the first Saturday of March. Every pew occupied, people standing along the walls and crowding into the doorway despite the chill that still lingered in the air. Asher sat in the front row at Pastor Whitfield's request, his hands folded in his lap, his face showing nothing of what he felt. Solomon waited outside, tied to the hitching post, his breath visible in the cold morning air. Jasper Ridgway stood first. The mining superintendent had aged a decade in 3 months. His expensive clothes had been replaced by simpler garments, his confident bearing diminished to something smaller and more human. He walked to the front of the church and turned to face the congregation, and when he spoke, his voice cracked on the first word. "I called this man's home the Badger's Burrow," Ridgway said. "I said it at the Sunday gathering in July, and I meant it as an insult. I said that Asher Ashcroft dug like a rodent because he thought like one. Too simple to build a proper house like civilized men. I laughed when I said it. Some of you laughed with me." He paused, his hands trembling at his sides. "I was proud of that mockery. I was proud of the way it spread through town, the way people repeated it and added to it. I was proud when my wife ensured that Mr. Ashcroft received no invitations to our gatherings, proud when the town treated him as something less than a neighbor." Ridgway's voice broke completely, and he stood silent for a long moment while the congregation watched. When he continued, tears were streaming down his weathered face. "My offices collapsed on the 9th day of the storm. Everything I had built with my fine lumber and my expensive glass lay broken in the snow, and I stood in the ruins of my own pride while the wind laughed at me. My children were freezing in my house, the house I built to show everyone how successful I was, how much better I was than a man who carved rooms into stone. My wife was burning our furniture to keep the fire alive, and I did not know how we would survive another night. He looked directly at Asher for the first time, his eyes red and swollen. And then Asher Ashcroft opened his door to us. The man I had mocked, the man I had excluded, the man whose labor I had derided as the work of a simple mind. He fed my children bread that came warm from his oven, while my offices lay shattered in the snow. He taught my wife how to preserve food. He gave us blankets and shelter, and asked nothing in return except that we make room for the next family who needed the same. Ridgway's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I was the simple one. I was the rodent, building my nest of pride and mockery while a wiser man built something that would endure. Mr. Ashcroft, I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway, because I do not know how else to live with what I have done. He returned to his seat, his shoulders shaking, and Margaret Ridgway took his hand without a word. Ezekiel Tanner stood next, the old prospector who had watched the storm approaching from the general store sidewalk on that first morning in November. His voice was steadier than Ridgway's, but it carried the same weight of confession. I told people that Asher read animal droppings like tea leaves, the old man said. When he mentioned the Picas carrying extra grass and the elk coming down early, I repeated Ridgway's joke about the circus. 30 years I have lived in these foothills. 30 years I have watched the signs that the land offers to those who pay attention. And when a man pointed to those same signs and tried to warn us, I mocked him instead of listening. He shook his head slowly, his weathered face creased with regret. I lost 3 fingers to frostbite during the storm. I lost my cabin when the roof collapsed on the 12th day. I lost everything I owned except the clothes I was wearing when I crawled through the snow to Mr. Ashcroft's door. And he took me in. He wrapped my frozen hands in warm cloth and fed me soup and gave me a corner where I could sleep without dying. The man who reads animal signs like tea leaves saved my life because he read those signs correctly and I did not. Mr. Ashcroft, I am sorry. I should have listened. I should have learned. Pastor Whitfield spoke third, his voice carrying the formal cadence of a man accustomed to addressing congregations, but stripped now of all pretense. I am guilty of a different sin, the minister said. I did not coin the nickname or organize the exclusion, but I watched it happen, and I said nothing. I preached sermons about loving thy neighbor while one of my neighbors sat alone in his cave, separated from the community by my own silence. I blessed meals at gatherings from which Mr. Ashcroft was deliberately excluded, and I pretended not to notice the empty seat. When I walked through the storm to ask for his help, I expected him to refuse. I expected him to demand an apology before he would open his door, and I would have deserved such a demand. Instead, he said 2 words, bring everyone. Not bring those who were kind to me. Not bring those who deserve shelter. Everyone. The man I had failed through 3 years of cowardly silence offered more grace in 2 words than I had offered in 100 sermons. Mr. Ashcroft, the church owes you an apology, and I am here to give it. For those of you who are touched by stories of human resilience and the power of grace under pressure, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might benefit from hearing it. Margaret Ridgway stood last among the confessors, her face pale but composed, her voice steady in a way her husband's had not been. I organized the exclusion, she said simply. I made certain that every invitation list excluded Mr. Ashcroft's name. I ensured that every social gathering, every church supper, every community celebration occurred without his presence. I told myself that I was protecting the town from a strange man, a man who did not belong, a man whose grief made others uncomfortable. I told myself many things that allowed me to sleep at night while I systematically erased another human being from our community. She paused, her composure cracking for just a moment. On the 14th day of the storm, I sat in Mr. Ashcroft's cave with my children, eating bread that he had baked with his own hands, wrapped in blankets that he had purchased with his own money, and I watched him teach my son how the oven worked, patient and kind, asking nothing except that the boy pay attention. My son, whom I had taught to look through Mr. Ashcroft as if he were invisible. My son, who learned more about survival in one afternoon than I had taught him in all his young years. I wept that night, Mr. Ashcroft. Not because I was cold or frightened, but because I understood finally what I had done, and I could not undo it. I can only say that I am sorry, and I can only ask if you might one day find it in your heart to forgive a woman who did not deserve the grace you showed her. She sat down, and the church fell silent. Every eye turned to Asher Ashcroft. He rose slowly from his seat and walked to the front of the church, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He stood where the others had stood and looked out at the faces of his neighbors, these 409 souls who had survived the Great White Siege because a widower from Philadelphia had listened to his grandfather and carved rooms into stone. My grandfather used to say that the earth remembers those who listen to her, Asher began, his voice quiet but clear. He wrote those words in his journal while he was frozen into the ice off the Labrador coast, surrounded by men who were dying because they had trusted their wooden walls instead of learning what the land could teach them. He survived because he paid attention. He survived because he respected the cold instead of trying to defeat it. And when he came home, he wrote down everything he had learned, so that someone else might survive what he had survived. Asher paused, his eyes moving from face to face across the congregation. I did not carve those rooms to prove anything to anyone. I carved them because I could not bear to live in a structure that might burn, that might collapse, that might fail when failure meant death. I carved them because my grandfather taught me that the earth endures when everything else fails, and I believed him. I still believe him. His voice softened, but did not waver. You ask for forgiveness. I hear your words, and I understand the courage it took to speak them. But forgiveness is not mine to give, not in the way you mean. I cannot undo the years of silence, cannot unhear the mockery, cannot unfeel the exclusion that followed me like a shadow through this town. Those things happened. They are part of me now, woven into the stone I carved, and the bread I baked, and the life I built while you watched and laughed. The congregation sat motionless, barely breathing. What I can give you is this, you. I hold no hatred in my heart. Hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it. And I have had enough of fire. I choose to set it down. I choose to walk forward without its weight. That is not forgiveness. It is survival. It is what my grandfather taught me to do when the cold comes, and the wind howls, and there is no way through, except to endure. He looked at Jasper Ridgway, at Margaret, at Pastor Whitfield and old Ezekiel Tanner. You called my home the Badger's Burrow. Perhaps that name was meant as mockery. But the badger survives when other creatures do not. The badger digs deep and waits out storms that kill those who stay exposed. I will carry that name if you wish to give it, and I will not be ashamed. His voice rose slightly, taking on a quality that silenced even the rustle of clothing. What I offer instead of forgiveness is this. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. I will show you how to read the signs that the land offers, how to build structures that endure, how to prepare for winters that have not yet come. My grandfather gave me his knowledge so that I would not die as his shipmates died. I will give you the same knowledge, freely, without cost, because knowledge shared is not knowledge lost. It is knowledge multiplied. He stepped back from the front of the church. The earth endures. Build with her. That is all I have to say. Asher Ashcroft died on the 17th of September, 1931, at the age of 78. He passed peacefully in the room he had carved 46 years earlier, surrounded by the stone walls that had sheltered him through 4 decades of Colorado winters, his grandfather's journal open on the small table beside his bed. They found him in the morning, his face calm, his hands folded as if in sleep, the early autumn light falling through the entrance he had carved when he was a younger man with fresher grief and steadier hands. If you have been moved by Asher's journey from outcast to teacher, please consider sharing this video with someone who might need to hear that patience and preparation are their own forms of strength. Solomon had preceded his master by 11 years, dying in the spring of 1920 at the age of 29. Asher had buried the gelding in a small plot at the base of the cliff, marking the grave with a stone he carved himself, and he had visited that stone every morning until his body would no longer carry him down the path. The inscription read simply, "A faithful companion who understood." By the time of Asher's death, Deerfield had become famous throughout Colorado and beyond for its cliff dwellings. 217 rooms had been carved into the sandstone faces surrounding the town, home to families who had learned the techniques from Asher himself and passed them down to their children. The Cliff District, as it came to be called, attracted visitors from as far as Chicago and New York, people who came to see the remarkable structures and to hear the stories of the widower who had taught a town to survive. The phrase "building like Ashcroft" had entered the local vocabulary, transformed from the mockery of "digging like a badger" to a term of highest respect. When someone said that a man was building like Ashcroft, they meant that he was building to last, building to endure, building with the patience and foresight that had saved 409 lives during the Great White Siege of 1887. The Badger's Burrow became the name of the town's annual Preparedness Festival, held every October, when families gathered to share supplies and check their stores and teach their children the lessons that Asher had taught their grandparents. Jasper Ridgway became one of Asher's most devoted students. The former mining superintendent spent the last 20 years of his life learning the techniques of earth-insulated construction, eventually carving a modest dwelling of his own near the original Ashcroft Cave. He died in 1912, and his sons continued the work he had begun, their children inheriting both the knowledge and the humility that their grandfather had found so late in life. The Ridgway family donated the land where the mining company offices had once stood to the town, and it became a public square where the Preparedness Festival was held each year. The cliff dwelling that Asher carved still stands. The Historical Society maintains it now, keeping the stone floors swept and the earth oven functional. Visitors come from across the country to walk through the 7 rooms and to stand in the main chamber where 63 people once sheltered from the worst winter in Colorado memory. They touch the worn stone threshold, smoothed by decades of passing feet, and they read the brass plaque that was installed above the entrance on the 10th anniversary of Asher's death. The inscription reads, "The earth endures. Build with her." Ezra Ashcroft would have recognized those words. He had written them in his journal on a frozen night off the Labrador coast, surrounded by ice and darkness and the certainty that morning might never come. He had survived that night, and all the nights that followed, because he had learned to listen to what the earth was teaching him. His grandson had listened too. And because Asher Ashcroft had listened, 409 people had lived to tell their grandchildren about the winter when a man they had mocked became the one who saved them. The cave still stands, a testament to patience and preparation, and the enduring truth that the earth remembers those who listen to her. Visitors who press their hands against the cool sandstone walls sometimes say they can feel something in the stone, a warmth that has nothing to do with temperature, a presence that lingers long after the carver has gone. The Historical Society guides smile when they hear this. They have heard it many times before. Above the entrance, the brass plaque catches the afternoon light. The words upon it are simple, but they contain everything that matters. Ezra Ashcroft, who wrote those words in a frozen ship's log so many years ago, would have been proud to see them carved into stone at last, enduring as he had always known the earth would endure, long after the wooden structures and the proud men who built them had crumbled into dust and been forgotten.